בוקר טוב לכולם.
Good morning, everyone. The distinguished following guest, one could confuse with the Edelston School entrepreneurship scholars, or just as someone who's just been accepted here at our MSc course as one of the mentors of these courses. His military service, he started in the Chief of Staff Special Commando unit, and a commander, an officer, and as a high-tech owner and startup companies that he actually accompanied all the way through to their exit. And then he started working in the public service with two very impressive roles as the head of the headquarters of the Prime Minister's office, and continued through in that path and fighting the BDS and the delegitimization of the State of Israel. It was natural for him to, of course, join the Knesset. And it's the second Knesset that he has been. He is now a minister in the Security Cabinet. It is an honor for me to invite a true friend of the IDC, the Minister of Education and Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Mr. Naftali Bennett, MK and Minister. The Minister will be interviewed by a member of the new broadcasting corporation that is now in its pilot stages. Shalom, Naftali. Good morning, everyone. I know that you like immediately starting with right, left, political and other issues, but we'll get to those in a moment. Let's start, though, with education. You've been there for 2 years. What has surprised you the most at the ministry in these first 2 years, the Ministry of Education? Well, the possibility to generate deep changes during a short term, and sort of a short time to do things. People often say you can't change anything. I don't agree with that at all. One can. We saw a kind of fading, waning of the scientific field, in other words, what we've called STEM, mathematics, English, etc., over a decade. I mean, the State of Israel went from 13,000 people who did 5 units in mathematics to 8,500. And it looked as if it was irreversible, but we acted and we said, no, we're going to make that double in mathematics, physics, chemistry and biology. And we created a kind of coalition with high-tech companies, people from the third sector, and together with people from the field of education, and we actually changed the trend. And I'm delighted to be a harbinger of good tidings and say that in the matriculation units, 16,000 people did 5 units in mathematics, 17-year-olds. And I believe that that is the social project that we should call number 1 in the State of Israel. We'll talk about 16,000 boys and girls from Ofakim, Rahat, Shlomi, Kiryat Shmone. In other words, we'll talk about the periphery as well as the center. Okay, they're going to have 5. It's not just those who go to our Signet 820 unit in the army. We're talking about children from the periphery. Talk about growth in the periphery, and that truly molded optimism and fused it into my heart. And we thought that we were at a no-return point. No, but we said, yes, if there's a vision, if you have made an objective that you intend to achieve, that's it, you can do it. So that's my greatest surprise of all. Now, if you are talking about things that you've marked as a target or an objective, what is your next target and objective? I think that the greatest challenge of the educational system is relevance. I think to a great degree and extent, I think we are preparing children for a world that existed 60 years ago. I think that this concept of a teacher standing in a frontal way, lecturing to a classroom, and they immediately have to learn it off by heart for their civic studies exam, and then they throw it into the bonfire afterwards, those books. I think now in 2017 we need a kind of mature person that is totally different from what we needed in the past. I'm going to start with what I didn't look for in the startup companies rather than what I looked for. What are the 4 reasons when you talk about you know, you need to know these things, not talk about what were the most important things during the time of the ghettos, etc., etc. All that is important. But I was looking for something different, creative people, team workers. And these capabilities need to be actually built and created. And I think in the next few years, I want initiative. I want entrepreneurship in the educational system. I want children to initiate all sorts of kind of enterprises and endeavors in education, in social issues. Because a young girl who is starting first grade, a little girl, when she joins the labor market, half of those professions that exist nowadays will no longer exist. Accountants, drivers, barely will we need people who will actually repair the cars afterwards because the accidents will have decreased so significantly. So I think that she'll be able, at the age of 22, she'll be able to sort of go all the way through till she retires and pension. She'll be changing jobs, etc., etc. So in other words, we need tolerance, sensitivity, and that kind of entirety. So beyond this line of just strengthening what we call the STEM studies, that already when actually starts off, it already exists, that is something we want to actually persevere with. Where do you stand when, with the whole Olmert affair of the previous Prime Minister? Do you think we're also just breathing down his neck and framing him kind of thing? Well, first of all, I would like to wish the previous Prime Minister, Olmert, a speedy recovery. Well, of course, we don't always share views, but one should never turn someone who has contributed so much to the security of Israel into someone who is as if against the security. He has tremendous privileges and rights because of all he exerted and gave to our security. We're talking, I mean, just to say that it's a publishing house now and the whole issue that is going is really, and all the aspersions being cast, we want to see why such a thing should happen. Do you think that someone is sort of really just casting aspersions about him and framing him? Well, I think that we ought to know how to be also compassionate, merciful, and not only adhere to law. I think that now the issue of the supply of electricity to Gaza, that the Palestinian Authority decided that they don't want so much to be provided, and how does this tie in with the MIA's bodies that we want to have returned from the Gaza Strip? I think that in Gaza and all the fronts, our supreme priority is to try and prevent a conflict. And if we find ourselves entangled in a conflict, then we have to have a decisive victory. But let me start with the preemptive step. Someone who is actually stopping the monies, it is the Palestinian Authority. They're very complex questions. There is one vector as how do you reject and postpone any kind of conflict? And on the other hand, how do you also try and prevent their arming and because after all, and their strengthening and the building of their force, because all their monies they use is for actually buying arms instead of for humanitarian needs. So, I mean, if we talk about our MIAs who are Shaul Oron and Hadar Goldin, our MIAs bodies who are that are there, our sons' bodies. So we said that until I actually was one of the initiators of Protective Edge in order to stop the building of tunnels. But as far as I'm concerned, we have not completed this mission until they have been brought home. At the moment, the parents were at a crossroads and they decided not to wield pressure on the State of Israel, but rather on Hamas. In other words, it's the opposite of the previous models wherein, even from a moral point of view, we need to harness all our energy towards that. But even from a functional point of view, from a point of view of actually what would benefit us, the parents are looking at this, the golden sort of model or the Shalit model, and I think that they would choose a different model. And I think in all the relevant fora, I use all the power I have in order to step on Hamas's toes in order to release the children, rather than wielding pressure on the government of Israel, because I completely and vehemently object to the release of murderers who have killed our children, convicts who were accused of that. Now, from the point of view of the supply of electricity, it's a very complex issue because some of it is for civilian uses, and there are other levers that I would like to sort of detail, and I do normally speak about those in various fora, and those are the ones I think that ought to be used. But now, would you say that the Gaza is, you're saying that it is not the greatest and most significant challenge and threat for Israel? So what is the greatest threat? I think on a practical level, it's Hezbollah, because it's pretty amazing. As an officer in the 90s, and I was in a combat unit, you know, in the special forces. At the time, Hezbollah was a sort of minor and not that threatening as an organization because we were in constant friction with them. But in that constant friction, we prevented the creation and the empowering of such a threat. Now we're talking about 130,000 missiles that are actually aimed at the various towns of Israel, and that is a significant threat. The way to grapple with it is to prevent conflict by creating an equation that I've been pushing for in the cabinet, and I think that more or less we've succeeded in actually balancing that equation, and that is through Lebanon. Now, what is the problem with this asymmetric sort of battling? I mean, it's like holding on to water in your hands. I mean, what does actually a missile room look like in a Lebanese house or in a Gaza one? You've got a kitchen, you've got a bedroom, and you've got a rocket room in the houses. In other words, there is no real way of separating these issues. They are in their houses. So I think that the core of our error was that we were told, attack Hezbollah as much as you want, but don't touch Lebanon. But that's impossible. I think that that is a mission impossible. I think for 20 years I've been serving in the reserves of the army, and I was a hunter, a commander of a force that was a missile hunter or a rocket hunter, and I'm good at it. If you ever need anyone like that, I'll come and be the hunter. And the only way of doing that is to take the water, as I was saying, freeze them, turn them into ice, and then you can hold on to them. In other words, the moment Lebanon will know that as far as we're concerned, we do not see Hezbollah as an autonomous entity, but they are part and parcel of the Lebanese government, of the whole Lebanese mechanism, then I think then we'll be able thus to prevent the future conflict, and if we don't prevent it, at least shorten it in a significant manner, and at least prevent the war that will follow. I think the representatives of the, Greenblatt and Kushner came here, the representatives of President Trump. Do you think that there's really the possibility of a political process? I'm not worried about that. We do want peace. But the question is, for what aim? In this process, what will happen? The downside in that kind of process, in the acceptable processes, is that they're not creative whatsoever. They're very standardized. And they usually end with that same kind of terrible, desperate disappointment. So when we are so disappointed, we find ourselves at a lower level than we were before. And when there is something that hasn't been solved, we are mature people in our personal, private lives, but in a national lives. You need to grapple and cope and contend with something that has not been solved. So in those negotiations, usually in exchange for that right to negotiate, we find ourselves to make more concessions, either releasing terrorists like we had in the previous term of office, and we prevented the release of those Israeli terrorists. So why should we be paying with hard currency just for the right to sit down with Abu Mazen? So now we're talking about the doubling of the town of Kalkilia. You have to understand the meaning of it. Here in Herzliya or Kfar Saba, to bin 6,000 units, buildings, sort of alongside the main highway 6, can you imagine having all those roads along the main highway? I mean, do you think that that is a logical thing to do? We're talking about Territory 6. We don't want them not to be able to develop their lives, the Palestinians. I was one of the I said that they need to live somewhere. So I did want them to develop places, but it shouldn't be at the expense of Israeli territories and areas, and it should not endanger Tzur Yig'al, Kfar Saba, and Kochavia Ir residents. In other words, we have to do something that will be wise from a security point of view. And just as in Protective Edge, we succeeded in leading the government and also with the law of arrangement, then we also succeeded in doing that. So we have to try and prevent creating that security danger around Kfar Saba. Now, if we're talking about the development of those negotiations with the Palestinians and Israeli, can you tell me at what point would you say that now the Beit Yehudi party, what is the sort of point of no return that you're not accepting a point in those negotiations? I'm not going to start giving out ultimatums. I was in the previous government when Tzipi Livni was negotiating with Abu Mazen. I have no problem. In the government, I always say, bring peace and then we'll talk. In other words, what we need to do is we need to go over this again and again. I thought that we ought to take advantage of these current 4 years and define peace as non-combatant, non-fighting, non-war. Because, you know, we kind of fire slogans in the air and then we feel as if we're falling flat on our faces. And I am establishing port and infrastructure. That is what I believe in. Shared industrial areas, because no one's going anywhere. Israel are staying here. The Palestinians are staying here. We don't want to annex those 2 million Palestinians. So let us help them, these civilians. We have been doomed or destined to live together. So let us try and actually improve things. So even if there isn't great love, let's try and create constructive neighborly ties and relations. And I think most specifically, because I'm a businessman, I think, by the way, out of all the politicians in the Knesset, I was actually a businessman who succeeded in the United States with hundreds of deals. And I understood that with the Americans, you need to speak sincerely, openly. And I would like to say to him, President Trump, we can now sit down. We're not going to reach some kind of golden mean. It's basically, let's not waste the time. But unfortunately, we keep going on with these maneuvering ideas, which they think is productive. I have a real program for shared entrepreneurship, and we can do beautiful things together with the Palestinians. So in other words, by the way, the government is the most right-wing ever. And despite it being that, doesn't really build and construct in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. What does that mean to you? Well, I was actually yesterday, I said I was delighted to hear that they are going to enable more construction in Ramat Shlomo and in Gilo, Har Homa, Talpiyot, because in the southern Talpiyot area there was a freeze, and they've agreed now to defreeze these areas. There is construction, it doesn't suffice, but that isn't the be-alls and end all. I think that, we have to look at other things. We've got first-class education, first-class other things here with the IDC and with Uriel Reichman. We've been doing some lovely things. So there are things that need to be done, and I prefer to look at the entire picture, at, grosso modo, rather than just looking at things narrowly. I think that the state of the nation at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, is good, but I think, and our economy is good. At an international level, our position is improving, our education is improving, and under Ayelet Shaked's leadership, the Justice Ministry is improving. So I think that one of our problems, though, is definitely the polarization in society, in our society, and we all sinned by thinking that if we rift between the left and right and secular and religious, no, there's no upper side to that. Unfortunately, it just deepens the problems. So I think that I was really extremely significant in bridging the gaps in our internal society through the system of education, and that is something I deeply believe in, and there is so much to be done.
I'm very optimistic, but if I may say something about economics very briefly, we have witnessed in the last few days and also in recent times in general, we saw that there's some sort of an athletic industry, a sport, taking someone who is way up high and now putting them all the way down. If people have committed crimes, they should be in prison. But businessmen and women, they're not the enemies. We should lay out red carpets to any entrepreneur who is willing to invest funds in order to create jobs here in Israel. This week, in my office, was a very Zionist man who has invested hundreds of millions of shekels in Israel. And he said, I feel that the Israeli government is doing everything in its power to limit me, to create an anti-business atmosphere. Why is high-tech prospering? Why isn't the domestic business world not prospering? Because when I was in high-tech, the Israeli market was irrelevant, so I didn't feel all these distresses. Israel's entrepreneurs are heroes, and we need to give them power, to make it easier for them, and to undo these bottlenecks in order to create better jobs for Israelis. Well, as you can see, the time is moving up instead of down, so I guess they're adding time for us because what you're saying is interesting. But let's go back to education. The code of ethics. Did you foresee the attack when you began with this code of ethics for the academic world? And finally, after all of this noise, is there going to be a code of ethics, or did you just get the political gain from the media attention, and at the end of the day, it's not going to happen? Well, let's differentiate between what should be and what is happening. Our academic world here in Israel has made many achievements, but there are some phenomena that I don't think are conceivable or acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable that a lecturer in Israeli universities who is financed by Israel should support the ban or the BDS and so on. I don't think that a PhD candidate will be afraid of stating their opinion because their political position is not something people want to hear. I don't think it's acceptable that a university should have a legal clinic where students get credit points, and that clinic should protect terrorists and try to cut their sentences short. And all of these things have happened, are happening, and since the storm, as you like to call it, I have been getting emails of many examples. So I have contacted a man who is not really right-wing, you might say, Professor Asa Kasher, and I had coordinated it with the Council of Higher Education, and I asked him to suggest a proposed code of ethics. He did a wonderful job, and I really do admire and appreciate his work, and that really is a starting point for dialogue. And unfortunately, everything has been so distorted in the media. We have no intention of limiting the freedom of expression. On the contrary, by taking upon themselves and conforming to this code of ethics, it will give them more opportunities. So we are beginning the discussions with universities, with student bodies, and at the end of this dialogue, I hope to see the implementation, whether self-implementation, self-imposing by each one of the institutions, or we'll see how it goes. We'll go with the flow. I don't like to say at the beginning of a process what will happen at the end, but I can say that either way, as far as I'm concerned, if it depends on me, we will not allow Israeli professors to call for the ban of Israel and continue to be in the academic world. That is not freedom of expression. To ban Israel is not freedom of expression. It is harming Israel. I feel like you're making sounds as if you're willing to compromise as long as this principle that you've just mentioned will ultimately be embedded. Certainly I'm open to dialogue. Professor Asa Kasher, and here is the place to say that everyone is attacking him terribly for proposing a code of ethics. He doesn't see it as the Ten Commandments, and as he said, if it were a different minister, it wouldn't be such a big noise, and I think it's true. I agree with him. So many attacks. People didn't even read this code of ethics before they went on the attack. So we're starting a dialogue. I want to get as broad a consensus as possible. And there are some points that one way or the other I'm going to implement, and I assume it will indeed happen. Final question, a political question. Is Naftali Bennett, will he always be in politics as part of the Jewish home, Habayit HaYehudi, or is there any option of any other party or organization you'll be part of? I am very proud to be heading Habayit HaYehudi, the Jewish Home Party. We must know that this party needs to change. It needs to open up much more. I brought Ayelet Shaked, and it was like a historical step in the party for the first time. Not only a secular person, but one who's a woman. And of course, that has been tremendous success. We need 2-3 more like her. I personally am living a life that is like general Israeli population. I have just marked 20 years to getting to know my wife Gilat. She was in the paratroopers. I had just finished my army service. I'm from the urban area of Israel. She's from the Moshav. I'm religious. She's secular, and we live a wonderful life together. And since I can remember, in the IDF and in high tech, I have always led a general Israeli life, sharing it with others, and I feel very hurt by any talk of a sector, of the different sectors, and I have not been able to realize the Jewish home dream. The Druze and Arabs can also take part in it as long as they take on the Jewish home view, and my vision is very clear. I'm optimistic. I'd like to realize it, and I hope that in the next elections, with 8 mandates, we have done so much. If it's the revolution in the math area, and what Minister Shaked is doing in the legal system, and the justice system, and the referendum law, and for the first time ever, we have put back in prison those terrorists released under the Shalit deal and have gone back to terrorism and were therefore reincarcerated. And we are leading the government in these areas, so just imagine what we can do with 20 or 25 mandates. Minister of Education Naftali Bennett, thank you very much.